in the government in Batavia. No one, I worked in an ice cream shop. No one can come up to me, I was a manager of an ice cream shop for 3 years. No one can come up to me and say, you can't do this because you're a woman. I can do anything. I can split, I can drive semi. I'm not licensed in a semi, but I can drive semi. My father taught me how to drive semi. I needed a load of gravel. I can drive a tractor. I can do anything. And I don't think that there's any reason why women should have to say, I am Mrs. Such and Such. I'm honored to be Mrs. Essling, but I'm Betty. Okay? The kids in the neighborhood know me as Betty. I'm not Mrs. Somebody. But women have come a long way. During the Civil War, women were quiet. Heaven forbid that I could stand in the front of a room and everyone in the back would hear me. During the Civil War, I should talk about this. I should keep my eyes on and I should walk 2 steps behind my husband. No. My husband and I are reenactors. Reenactors are people who dress up in funny clothes in 100-degree weather and go sit on the hillside and have picnics. I'm a Civil War reenactor. I'm going to show you the layers that I have on. These are the layers that I wear in 100-degree weather. This is summertime clothes that I am wearing. But my husband portrays Mr. Lincoln's bodyguard, a man named Ward Hill Lamont. He was a northern gentleman. He traveled with Mr. Lincoln all the way from Springfield. And he stationed himself with Mr. Lincoln most of the time that Lincoln was in Washington. No, Lamont did not screw up. When the Lincolns went to the theater, Mr. Lamont had already been sent to Richmond to start the paperwork for the Reconstruction. So he wasn't there, and his last line to Mr. Lincoln was, "You will stay home." And of course, Mr. Lincoln didn't listen then, and he lived better than he ever listened before. I, on the other hand, portrayed a lady by the name of Rose Greenhow. I lived in Washington before the Civil War, during the Civil War, not much after the Civil War. I dated President Buchanan, and I was Confederate. Now, Buchanan was the only president to not be married. His niece was the hostess of the White House, which was fine. If he wanted a small little dinner party, though, they were served in my house on F Street. So I had been in Washington long before the Lincolns came to Washington. I had been a widow for 12 years. So I had never gotten into the habit. And when my husband was alive, he traveled. He was an historian, and during that time, the historian was a gentleman that worked on the territories and the divisions of he drew the line and worked on the treaty that divides Mexico from the United States. He drew the 2 sharp lines that divide California. He worked on those treaties and he made those lines. His name was Robert Greenhow, and he was considered a historian, and he traveled a lot. We had 3 children, so I surely couldn't travel with him all the time, so I stayed on F Street. I was known for my elaborate teas, my elaborate dinner parties, but I am Southern. My husband's Union, I'm Confederate, so at reenactments, my husband's in that camp over there with the guys dressed in plain blue uniforms, and I'm in the camp over there, guys dressed in the gray uniforms. And we don't see each other on the weekend, and I don't do it. I portray a lady who went about doing what she wanted and doing what she wanted. And Rose Greenhow did that. She was not a quiet lady. She was outspoken many, many times. As I say, she came to Washington when she was 14 years old. She and her aunt ran the first congressional boarding house. Her name was Rose O'Neill at that time. She studied under a lot of gentlemen that were involved in government. Now I'm going to go into first person. So for you, that shouldn't be any problem. You understand that I's not me. I's Rose Greenhow. Okay? Children have a hard time with that. They keep wondering how come I look so good for 186 years old. I came to Washington when I was 14 years old. My aunt and I ran the first congressional boarding house. It was where the young men stayed who were involved in government. Instead of owning a home in Washington and in their state, they would stay in Washington in boarding houses. I met a man by the name of Calhoun. I took all my studying from Calhoun. He was a very independent, very strong man, and he believed in form of revolutionary blood in my veins, and a strong belief in right and wrong, and a strong belief in states. And that's really, through the rest of this, that's what drove me, was the belief that we were created for the rights of the states. That's why we came here, not to be led by one person, but to be led independently for the states. I met Robert Greenhow. As I say, he was an historian. He traveled quite a bit. A man of means. This is a position paid for by the government. So we had a beautiful house on F Street. We had 3 lovely daughters. My 3 daughters were on ready for finishing school, and Robert fell off of an elevated sidewalk and broke his neck. The sidewalk was in San Francisco, and it was 6 feet off the ground. Good reason. They say he died of complications of a fall. When I did a little bit more research, I realized that he had slid on a rainy day and fell on his head. So the complications were probably a broken neck. And so he left behind 3 daughters of marrying age. That doesn't mean that they were promised to anyone, but they were of age to be considered into finishing schools and ready to be married into society. And he also left behind a new baby named Rosie. Rosie's my namesake. She's 2 when her father dies. We returned back to Washington. Buchanan was the president at this time. And we took up with the household as we've been doing. My 3 daughters each went to finishing school, learned all the proper etiquette of the time. They learned how to have skinny waists and do embroidery and cooking and how to take care of servants. Because at that time, you can still take care of servants. Mr. Lincoln hasn't come and messed that up yet. Later on, we have to learn how to button our clothes down in front because there's nobody to help us button off the back. If you don't have children in your house, you're in trouble. When you have children in the house to button your clothing for you. Oh, of course, they're my children. Oh yes, your children would be able to button you up and your children would hook you into your corsets because you dress them. Children aren't into the modesty age yet. Once they turn about 12 or 14, then they would not look upon my bare back and I would not look upon their bare back. And let me tell you, it's hard to try to hook up a little girl's dress and not look at the naked skin. But they are very modest of the time. When Lincolns came to Washington, a lot of states started to secede from the Union. As the states started to secede from the Union, the ladies and gentlemen of Southern persuasion went home. I had never lived anywhere else. I'd only ever lived in Washington, so I stayed even though I was a Southern sympathizer. I had done as I'd always done and kept on with my routine. I'd go and sit in on cabinet meetings and sit in on government meetings, have teas in my house in the afternoon and dinner parties in the evening. Well, once the Lincolns came to Washington, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Jordan approached me. Thomas Jordan asked me if I'd be willing to start an espionage unit. As long as it didn't endanger my children, I said fine. I asked him what I needed to do, and that was quite easy. All I needed to do is what's been done here. Invite all the ladies from the town over for tea in the afternoon and go from table to table and visit with them. Find out whose husbands had what information and whose husbands were working for what part of the government. And then that night or the next night, I'd invite husbands back over for dinner. There's no fact that if you feed a gentleman well, give him lively spirits, sit quietly and listen, he'll tell you anything. And times haven't changed. So all I had to do was feed him well and just sit and listen to him quietly. And it was quite common at that time for the gentleman to dine somewhere else beside his own home. He would probably have his morning meal in his own home. But if he was working on business, it was quite common to dine in someone else's home or at wherever the meetings were being held at. One of the best meetings that I thought ever took place in my house was for the Secretary of War. I had gone to a cabinet meeting and sat in, and I understood that they were going to decide where the first battle on Virginia territory was going to be fought. So I decided they might as well decide that at my house. I served them an elaborate dinner. We had chicken, we had raffled lamb, we had mutton, we had beef. We had 3 types of potatoes. We had whipped potatoes, we had sweet potatoes, and we had a candied new potato, a couple different kinds of vegetables, whatever was fresh, 3 types of bread, and then homemade peach cobbler for dessert. Whenever she decided she was going to entertain, she always wrote down what she had. So I know what was served for every dinner party that she ever gathered information from. Because besides writing down what information was given, she wrote down what she served to see if there was any correlation between the food served and the amount of talk with the men. Peach cobbler is a good draw. Gentlemen will sit forever and linger over a piece of peach cobbler. Well, after the dinner was done, they went out on the porch to have their cigars and a little bit of pork. I had the table cleared, and I laid parchment down on my old table. Quite the same idea as you put a tablecloth on a table. I didn't want the gentleman writing on my table and etching through. So I laid my parchment down. They laid their maps down. They decided Manassas would be a good place to have the battle, so they wrote Manassas on the board, on the map. Then they decided who the commanding officers were going to be, and they wrote that across the top of the map. They decided what part of the railroad that they wanted to break it so the Confederate soldiers couldn't get up through, and they marked that. And they marked the strategic points for location, and went home. I rolled up the parchments and sent them on to the Confederate Army. The Confederate Army knew 6 days in advance of the Union Army that there was even going to be a battle, before the Union soldiers even knew there was a battle. And then 2 days before the battle was to take place, I again went in and sat on the cabinet meeting, found out exactly who the highest ranking officers were going to be and exactly how many men they were all going to be in charge of. So I sent that information out to General Beauregard by a lady by the name of Sally Duvall. It wasn't hard. You just sit and listen. It's amazing what you can learn. Well, there was a gentleman at the time by the name of Pinkerton. He was in charge of the Secret Service. The Secret Service during the Civil War is to take care of counterfeiters. They look for counterfeit monies and counterfeit alliances. A spy is considered a counterfeit alliance. Pinkerton put me under house arrest for 4.5 months. He had no proof, but he thought that maybe seeing that the dinner parties were at my house and the information was getting somewhere else a couple days later, that it was probably coming from my house, but he had no proof. He held me there for 4.5 months. During that time, there was a man positioned at my side at all times. You don't know how distressing it is to try to change and have a gentleman not be willing to turn his back. I would sleep in my shift, in my corset, rather than change my clothes in front of him. Some of the men were easily bought, and they would turn their head for me, but there were other ones that would not, and I would not touch this rope. I just wouldn't do it. During that time, other women who were convicted of being a spy were also brought into my house, but they were of a lower class, and they stole from me, and they had bugs and disease, and I did not want them in my house. So I asked to be put into prison. I was held in the old Capitol prison for 5.5 months, and my house was closed, so no one could stay there. I chose the 3 rooms that I wanted in the prison. Well, because the prison was the first congressional boarding house that my aunt and I had run when I was a young girl. So I just took my bedroom back again. I knew what room I wanted. My daughter Rosie was stationed with me. The 3 older daughters would not have anything to do with me by this time. They'd all taken northern alliances and northern husbands. But it was their choice. So Rosie stayed with me in prison. I was held there for 5.5 months. During that time, more messages were released from me while in prison that were ever gone through my house. The best thing they did was imprison me. Because I could find a lot more information and pass it on a lot easier through prison. Rosie and I were released. Jefferson Davis paid $2,000 for our release. And I went south. I took with me 22 trunks of belongings to sell. The ladies of the South really couldn't afford to buy my wares. So I went to Europe. And I traveled through Europe, and I visited with the heads of the states in Europe, and the monarchies, and the kings and queens. And I would visit with them. I was used to this part of society. I had done this with my husband. We stayed there until I had sold all my belongings, and I wrote 3 books. 2 of them are diaries. They're rather dull. But the ladies of the time wanted to read exactly what happened. Then there's another book that I wrote that everyone seemed to enjoy much later. It was called The Rebel Rose. And that one's a fictional book based on my life. But it's got a lot of the right information. And it was more for the people who enjoyed a little bit of the story. On my way back the last time, I was on a boat called the Condor. I was a blockade runner. We'd be followed by a Union gunboat. If I was to be captured, I could be shot or hung as a spy. So I was asked to put off into a small rowboat. On the way to shore, the rowboat capsized, and I drowned. The reason I think that I may have drowned was because we started out with some layers here. I don't know if everyone got to see them or not. If I was traveling, I'd have on some kind of a shoe or a boot, and then my cotton stockings. And then over the top of your cotton stockings, you have some kind of drawers. Now the underpinnings that I'm showing you are antiques. You have some kind of drawers. These are called bifurcated drawers. They're not ripped. They're made this way. And all the work down on the bottom is all done by hand, if you wanted to come up and see them later. It makes for fun picnics in the park. For picnics in the park. Actually, by the time you hook on your corset and everything, you can't get to your panties to pull them down. This is a necessity more than anything else. Because once the corset hooks over everything, you're pretty much out of luck. Okay, then this is a chemise. This goes out over the top of the drawers. This chemise is all tucked at the waist. Usually they were nice and full, but this one's tucked at the waist, so obviously the lady didn't want quite as much fullness. Over the top of that, you put your corset. No, this one's not whalebone. These are steel. The whalebone corsets had started to rot by this time. The whalebone was disintegrating, and it was very expensive to get whalebone. Steel was much cheaper, so they would use steel in the corsets. Now, I apologize, ladies, I don't have my corset on today, but I wanted to, don't giggle, I usually wear one. I had one on the whole weekend when I was at the farmer's daughter. I wore my corset, but I had to drive myself here today, and there was nobody at home to help me dress before I left, so no one could tighten my corset. Because I had to put my corset on first thing in the day. You can't put your corset on at 10 o'clock in the morning. If you don't put it on when you get out of bed, you don't put it on. Once the body starts to shift, you can't do it. And this one hooks up the front of the bosom, not in the middle, but hooks up the side, and then it laces on the sides. Some of the other ones you'll see hook up the front and lace up the back. Either way, the support is there. So I had on my corset, then over the top of your corset, and I do wear a corset in the summertime. Over the top of your corset, you have another petticoat which is under the hoop. This one is made for a younger person, a younger lady, we believe, because it has an extra panel for modesty. And some of them were just a single piece. This one has an extra panel. And then over the top of that, you have your hoop. I just put a small hoop on today for you ladies. Because I didn't know how much room I had between all the tables, so I put a small hoop on. I could actually wear a hoop about twice this size. About 180 is the bottom circumference on a hoop. Because I'm tall. This one is what's called a working hoop. It's a smaller hoop. It only measures about 110 to 120 inches. Now, for this pretty little lady in the white hat, her hoop mate would only measure 90 inches because she's so tiny. If you put a 120-inch hoop on, it's going to be bigger around as she is tall. So she's going to have a very tiny little hoop on. Over the top of my hoop, if I had a larger hoop on, you'd have an over-the-hoop petticoat. And Rose Greenhow would have had an over-the-hoop petticoat. Okay. This is so that you don't see the rows of banding in your skirt, on your hoop. Then I have on a Confederate flag. This is the first national flag of the Confederacy. 7 stars for the first 7 states to secede from the Union. I made this flag with materials that the Union Army gave me to make clothes for my daughter while in prison. When I walked out of prison, I had on a crisp new dress, black kid gloves buttoned tightly at the wrist, a new black hat perched firmly on my head, and that's actually risque because a lady of my age, a whole 50, should have had a bonnet on. But I came out with a hat with feathers. And a Confederate flag that she made with the materials that the Union Army had given her. No, I actually think that it was wrapped around her body, but all the writing say that she wore the flag out of prison. She probably didn't show anyone, because she wouldn't have shown anyone her boobs. Yes?
How long would it take you to dress?
Including doing hair, it would probably take the lady about 40 minutes to get dressed in the morning. Yeah. That includes washing and such like that. That doesn't include pressing. You press the day before, because it takes all day to press. But that's just about 40 minutes to get dressed in the morning and get yourself together. And as I said, then she would have had on her dress, and then a wool cape over the top of that, and $2,000 in gold sewed into her underpinnings, and she drowned. I don't know why. I mean, just like a candle wick, we absorb the moisture, it just kind of holds it in. Rosie was in finishing school in England. She was in a convent. When notification of my death reached her, her sisters were contacted as to which one was going to take care of her. Her sisters would not take her. She was 12 years old. She had been to finishing school, but because she was my child, my daughters would have nothing to do with her. Jefferson Davis again stepped in. He was a very kind and very loving man. He was kind to a lot of people. And he again stepped in, and he had Rosie adopted into a Confederate family and had her name changed. People found her, so he again changed her name. After the second name change, she married, but there's no listing of the man she married. So we don't know what the third name is. I can't trace Rosie back, and I can trace her back until she was 23 years old, and that's all the farther I can find her. I don't know what happened to her. The three older girls, one of them died shortly after the war. The other two had no children because they were afraid that the children would act like their grandmother, and they didn't think they could handle that. So they had no children, which is very unusual for the Civil War, because almost always you wanted to have a large family to help you with whatever the chores. Seeing Mr. Lincoln told us we could no longer own slaves and servants, we had to have a lot of children to help take care of us. And they had no children, which I found very unusual. A spy was a very gracious life. It was a very easy, very, very fun life to get into. But there were a lot of other things that the women did. Sanitary commissions were very big when it came to the women. A group of women like yourselves would have gotten together and helped with a sanitary commission. You would have picked out one or two of your husbands who were able to get around and get into different places. And you tell them the information that they needed to pass on, because ladies were very seldom in camp. But a sanitary commission's job was very important. They had the men go in first and look and see what conditions were like. And then the ladies would go in and tell the gentlemen how to change conditions. I'll be very delicate. Gentlemen would set up camp on a nice level area. And that's where the cook would take the water for drinking and the water for food, such like that. And the boys would go uphill to water their horses and bathe themselves, where no one could see them. And then they were drinking out of it at the bottom. Sanitary Commission came in and says, nice place to set your camp, boys, but how about walking that way? Don't go up the hill to the bushes, go down the hill. Gentlemen did not know, because gentlemen didn't cook, did not know that when you were given this raw piece of meat that was called a ration, that you were supposed to cook it and eat it. If they weren't hungry, if they'd eaten good the day before, if they had someone else had brought in food, they'd take this hunk of meat and put it in their haversack. And leave it there until they got hungry. And if it was 106 degrees, it doesn't take long of leaving it there before it turns bad. They take it out, start a little fire, put the skewer on the meat and cook it over a fire, and as soon as it got hot all the way through, they would eat it. Sanitary Commission ladies came in and said, hey guys, those little white things, that's not rice. They didn't know. They never smelled bad. Yeah, they smelled too. And the worst part was, they didn't clean the haversack. So they put all the raw vegetables and everything in there, and more meat in there, and whatever their hardtack, and they would keep putting it in this rancid box, and the bacteria just kept growing. Well, with that, they got tummy aches. Called it a case of dysentery. Sanitary Commission again stepped in and said, gentlemen, Don't do it behind your tent. Go into the woods, dig a hole. You do it behind your tent, you're going to let the bacteria keep growing in camp. You don't want this. But women had always taken care of the men. They didn't know enough to do this themselves. Sanitary Commission had to come in and tell them what to do. Sanitary Commission became the Red Cross, became the YWCA. Parts of the Sanitary Commission actually even turned into the YMCA for young men. And they were all basically started out as the same group or as a Christian league. And they would work together. And the Sanitary Commission would also get together in a group like this and do a quilting bee. And they'd make comforters for the soldiers, and they'd knit socks, and they would knit gloves and warm mittens for the soldiers and such like that. So they got together and had tea parties and made cookies and such and sent them on. But their main job was to make sure that the soldiers were treating themselves well. You had nurses. Nurses very seldom were on the battlefield. Does anyone know the first qualification for being a nurse in the early war? You had to be a man. Because women were not allowed to touch men that were not their husbands. So men had to be the early nurses. You didn't need any training to be a nurse. As the war went on, there weren't any men available because they were all being soldiers. So then women were allowed to be nurses. But you had to fit a criteria. Dorothea Dix made a list of rules, and if you did not qualify, you could not be a nurse. You had to be an older lady. You had to wear no hoops and always dark colors, dark browns, blacks, navy blues, dark grays, and you could not be pretty of face. This lady here in the front row would never make it as a nurse. She'd be disqualified right from the start because she has a very shy, a very glowing face. And they were afraid that when the soldiers woke up after being surgery done and looked up into this beautiful goddess of face, they thought they were dying about to heaven. It would excite the soldiers to think they were dead. They didn't want to excite the soldiers. So they didn't want pretty ladies. And also, if you were a pretty lady, chances are you could be married. You'd be able to find yourself a spouse. If you were not real pretty, very homely even, you'd make a good nurse because maybe one of those poor soldiers would feel sorry for you and fall in love with you and marry you. But once you've been a nurse, you're not fit to be a wife to somebody else because you're considered unclean because you touched a man's bare arm or bare foot. You didn't even have to see a wholly naked body. If you saw a chest, heavens, you're unclean. You're not fit to be married anymore. So they didn't want ladies that were of marrying age. They wanted ladies that were a little bit older. If you've been a mother, you can be a nurse. They figured you took care of the children when they were little, you could probably take care of the soldiers. You had to wear dark colors because there again it was not exciting and it hid the blood very well. Very practical, yes it was. Now one of the things, I don't usually get too much into the nursing part of it, but one of the things that the nurses found out, they were running out of sutures, out of cloth sutures. Keep in mind that when someone died, you took the sutures out and then you just if you take the bandage off of one and you use the bandage on another one, you didn't wash it, you just do it. But the nurses found out that they had to have more thread for stitching. So they went out and cut horsehair. But horsehair is too coarse, so they would boil it until it was soft. They found that the soldiers that were sewn with horsehair healed faster and had a lot less cases of infection and recovered much quicker. So they thought horsehair was magic. You'll find horsehair bracelets and horsehair rings because they were magic. What they were doing is they were killing the bacteria by boiling it. But they didn't know that. They thought that they were just softening it. And later they discovered that that's the reason that they healed better was because it was cleaner. And it worked. They started keeping things clean. There were women who wrote songs. Battle in the Republic was written by a woman. There were women who wrote books. There was a lot of books written by ladies during the Civil War time. There were ladies that ran shops. The only problem with running a shop is your husband probably owned it or a man owned it. You weren't allowed to own property. And if something happened to the man who owned the shop, it reverted back to his family, not you. If you did not have an 18-year-old son that could take care of that shop, the shop would go back to his mother and father and brothers, and they could decide whether you were going to stay there or not. The same with the house. You did not own the house. If he died, his family owned the house, and they could decide whether you were going to live there. And chances are, if it was a nicer house than what they had, they were going to kick you out. They were going to take your house because the woman was not allowed to own possessions. One of the things that happened during the war was they ran out of metal. Ladies' corsets were made out of metal. The boning in a lady's bodice is made out of metal. The hoops were made out of metal. The insets in the shoes were made out of metal. But as I say, the biggest thing was the corsets were made out of metal. There was a group in southern Illinois that needed to make soldiers' bullets because their soldiers had no bullets to protect themselves. So the ladies did the only thing that they thought was admirable. They burned their hoops. They melted down their hoops for metal to make the bullets out of. It was a group of ladies, probably about 1,500 ladies in this community. They got enough metal out of their corsets to make 27,000 bullets. So you can imagine how much steel they had tucked in different places. That's a lot of bullets. And then once the war was all over and the men came marching home with their heads held high, they walked into a household that had been run by a woman for 4 years and said, "Honey, I'm home. Move over, I'm taking over." And I really think that that was the beginning of women's lib. They didn't like the fact, and I can't imagine that I would like the fact of having a man gone for that long. And if you were lucky enough that he came home, that was great. There was a lot of them that didn't come home. But if you were lucky enough that your man came home, you were very grateful to see him. You thought that that was wonderful. But does he really have to move in that fast? And they did. The men came back in and said, "Okay, I'm here, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that." And they really didn't care how the women had controlled things up to that time, or how well they had run it. They were just going to come in and they were going to take care of this, and they were going to take care of the woman. And a lot of the women at that time, shortly thereafter, they started fighting for the right to vote. It wasn't too much farther on down the line. And I think that really started the revolution for women. It's come a long way. Some ways it hasn't. If you watch some of the silly talk shows on television, I watched one yesterday and thought, how can women still let people do this to them? We're independent. It proves here. We didn't have to bring our husbands with us to come and sit for the afternoon. They're probably sitting out in the parking lot waiting, but they didn't have to come in. I enjoy the Civil War. I don't enjoy war. When Rose Greenhow passed on her information during the Civil War, she passed on her information in hopes that the Union Army would see that the Southern Army was strong. They weren't a bunch of little backwoods boys that didn't know how to fire a gun. Her wishes for Manassas were that when the Northern soldiers came over the hill and they saw the Confederate soldiers standing there in a line, the Northern soldiers would say, "These aren't people to be reckoned with. Why don't we go back and renegotiate? We can do something different. We don't have to kill our brothers." And I truly think that that's the way that she felt. We know instead of the Battle of the First Manassas being the last battle of the Civil War, it was the first battle of the Civil War. And times changed unofficially through the years. But I don't think she meant for everyone to die, more than any of the other women who fought for the soldiers to die. She wanted to give the information so they could stand up and say, "We're strong, and we only want what they thought the Constitution said." And that's what women want now, too. I'm happy to see so many of you out today. I think that's really neat. And I apologize for being late. My carriage got stuck behind a carriage accident on 294. So it didn't quite work that way. But thank you very much. Do any of you ladies have any questions? Yes?
What was your husband doing all this time when you were in prison?
He died in 1852. He fell off the elevated sidewalk and broke his neck. And he died in 52 and left me a widow. Yes?
When you served those dinners, how many servants did you have?
3. I could serve a dinner party for up to 65 people with 3 servants because the servants knew how things were to be run. I tried, when Lincoln first came to Washington, I tried to get rid of my Negro servants because I wanted to fit in better, and I hired the Irish. migrating in that were willing to work, and they would be paid for their services. This is how they got their families over. They were willing to work. Their idea of work and my idea of work was two different things, so it just didn't work. We tried, they weren't compatible. But up through my death, I had 2 black servants that were with me at all times. Their choice, not mine. They weren't paid, but they were treated with the respect that I was treated, and I kept them with me simply because I needed someone to watch after Rosie, and I needed someone to help take care of me. Dresses buttoned down the back. Corsets hooked down the back. You really have to have someone help you put your hair up. Another job that was great during the Civil War was to be a hairstylist. You got paid $65 a head to do hair at a ball. You'd go in and let them know that you were coming into the ball ahead of time, and the women would make an appointment with you, and you got $65 a head. Yeah, it's more than today, but during Civil War time, and this is Civil War money, it was quite expensive. Yeah. Until she took it down, probably, well, you wouldn't want it the next day. Because by the next day, you're going back and doing your chores and such again. So you didn't want it all. And most of the time, it was hair pieces that were put on. And you would give the hair piece back. It would be restyled again to be used again. But you kept the hairdresser kept a block of hair pieces that matched. And if they didn't match exactly, then you would take and you would put coloring on your hair at the points where you needed to make it blend. But they would carry the hair pieces. And at that $65, you did not own the hair piece at the end of the day. The hair piece went back to the lady. Well, thank you very much. I've tied up much of your time. And if anyone has any questions, I will be sitting around.
Thank you so much, Betty. That was terrific, very informative, and thank goodness we live today.
Oh, my carpet bag. Yes, it's an authentic carpet bag. I had 2 leather handles on it. I wore out the other ones.
That was wonderful, and we do appreciate Betty coming all the way from Batavia. Betty, are you ever here in this little reenactment in our area?
I was in Beecher for the 100 and whatever anniversary that they had in Beecher. I came out. That's one of those days that if anyone was there, you know that it was 108 degrees, and us ladies were dressed. But the town of Beecher was very sweet. They let us into the post office, and we spent the night in the post office in our sleeping bags that left the air conditioners on for us.
Thank you. We're here, as you know, the main reason, besides, of course, the wonderful entertainment, is to honor 4 terrific ladies who have made their marks in Crete, and for our benefit, for the benefit of the rest of the community. So I would like to first have Leah Bradley come up. All of you know Leah Ray, of course. She's been a hard worker for the Crete Women's Club. She's been a terrific worker for the Historical Society. And it was Leah Ray's idea to have the friendship tea initially. So we thank you, we all of us thank you for this friendship tea. It's a wonderful idea, and it was her idea as a way to recognize women during Women's History Month, which is March every year. And so that was terrific. She's done a lot for her church. She's been a Sunday school teacher at the Trinity Lutheran School Church for over 35 years. She has been a big booster of the Crete High School music department and the Illinois Lutheran music department also. And as boosters of those organizations, the music departments, she initiated and having those groups come and participate at the Crete Art Fair a number of years. So she has done much to help the Crete, to promote music in Crete, to help children. And she's very caring, and That, and in that role, she has been able to get sponsors for nature education programs for 183 classrooms in the area, a number of them in Crete, and she goes and gives a lot of the presentations herself. You can read about several of the presentations in the program. She has done much for the Thorn Creek Audubon and for the education, especially with kids, to make them more aware of how important nature is. She's also been a director of the Jones Center Community Center, and also, let's see, there are many things on here, but she's also been a friend to many people in Crete when they have been sick and need someone to help them in Crete. So thank you very much. I present this to you, and thank you. The next one is Antoinette Rausch, which most of you, of course, know. With all the things she's done in Crete, you moved here, was it 48 years to Crete, years ago? She and her husband Harry, and they ran a grocery store and what is now known as a gatherings shop, was the old Creek hardware store. But before that, it was the Rausch's grocery store. She and her husband have been married how many years? 55? 57 years, which is a wonderful achievement. Yes, it is. Tony already also is a registered nurse, having graduated from the Augustana College that was in Chicago, right? Nursing. She was the president of the Crete Ampex Auxiliary here in Crete when it was extremely active. And you were president when Senator Albert Dirksen came to Crete, right, to dedicate the Crete Ampex building. And I understand that he landed in a helicopter over by the Crete Elementary School. So she did an awful lot that year. And she also did a tremendous amount for the Jubilee, right? The Jubilee was a 3-day event sponsored by the Ampex. There were a lot of activities for people here in Crete. And she does a tremendous amount as co-chairperson of the thrift shop for the Methodist Church. They have raised a lot of funds for the Methodist Church. And that's how many years? Over 30 years that she and Estelle Blair, one of our other honorees, another year, have worked for that thrift shop, doing a lot of things. Sorting, selling, accumulating, and selling. So we have this for you, Tony, and our appreciation for all that you've done for Crete. And thanks so much. And the fourth honoree is Joanne Zeros. Yay! Joanne has been a real promoter of education and communication of educational needs here in Crete. She's now president of the middle school PTO this year. She's been on the communications team. What was the other group? The other for the school? The district education council. She's been education chairman for the Crete Women's Club. She's trying to keep people aware of educational scholarships for the young people. She's done a tremendous amount for the Crete Art Fair sponsored by the Women's Club every year. She was the one that initiated the art space there where kids could come in to the art fair and have make their own creations, their own masterpieces. So she's done a lot with the Crete Art Fair. She's also contributed actually to this building just behind here as a small small little area where kids can sit down and a garden area right behind there. And that was sponsored by the Crete Women's Club, but she was a major force in doing that. Also, another major force in the garden area, the patio area behind the Crete Library. So you have done a lot. And the garden walk, yes. There has been, Joanne has been one of the three main leaders of the garden walk for a number of years. And we're very fortunate in that because it brings a lot of people to Crete, shows off our beautiful gardens here, makes us all very proud. And so you help all of us in making our community better, making us proud even more. So thank you so much. Well, I want you to keep this in mind for next year in January when we say to you, we need more nominees. I know we've recognized a number of people already here in Crete, but we have so many more women who have contributed to Crete, to the betterment of our community. And please keep in mind people that you know, because we want to continue to honor women and show people in our community how much a role, an important role that women have played in our community. So please keep that in mind for next year. And we thank you, all of you, for coming. Please, next year, keep us in mind in March again, Women's History Month. Also, the other thing I was going to say is, those of you who are here, who have been recognized before, and I know there are a lot of you as I look around, would you please stand up? I know, you know who you are. Please stand up. And we also want to thank, it was during when Ann Burkott was president, that she worked hard with Leah Ray to initiate this team. There were a lot of things done while you were president, so we thank you. We thank Nellie. Where's Nellie? When you were president too, there were a lot of things that were done. So it's been, I know this year being president, it's a big role. And so we all thank both of you for your work in being president of the society, and especially Ann, who helped work so strongly with Leah Ray in the beginning to get this off the road and as a significant event in Crete.
We need to thank Mary Ann Gemper also.
Mary Ann, thank you very much. Mary Ann too, who did it the last 2 years. Thank you very much. She's given me a lot of help this year too. And Leah Ray, even though we honored her this year, she's contributed so much to this team again. We thank you. And